Hello, and welcome to the next installment of Law & Order, the video series where I look at and unpack stories from games. In this one, we'll be looking at Bloober Team's Layers of Fear 2. After the success of Layers of Fear, this one was, well, it was different. It was slightly laborious at times, and despite it being creepy in places, it missed the mark on all the things that made the first one so good. However, it did have a fairly interesting story behind it, but this story was actually lost on some players because of how disjointed the flow of the game was. Nevertheless, if you want to check out my story explained video for Layers of Fear 1, it's up there, but let's roll the intro for this one and get started. You play as James, who is a famous method actor, on an ocean liner on which filming is taking place for a Hollywood movie. Making his way to a stage after walking down the hallways of the ship, which seems to be sinking, James spots a mysterious character standing behind a young boy. This mysterious character states that he almost had it, and then lifts the boy's head off of his shoulders. James awakens in his room on the ship, which now bizarrely no longer appears to be sinking. A deep voice is speaking to him, seemingly directing him. James watches a film reel and afterwards exits the room through a door which he previously entered from, and now finds himself in a completely different part of the ship. Whilst he explores the ship, it seems to shift between the present day and the past. It appears the director of the movie being shot on the ship has arranged for large parts of the ship to be cleared out and has set up numerous sets which feature mannequins. Throughout James's journey through the ship, past and present, James is forced to make choices which will affect the development of his character for the movie. Whilst he is visiting the past, James journeys through what seems to be his and his sister Lily's childhood home. This journey is steeped in childlike imagination, as James likely remembers the stories that he and his sister used to play out together. Eventually, after a long journey through memories of the past, James finds his way to the director's stage and one of three things happen. But before we discuss these endings, let's dive deeper into the story. So let's discuss James and Lily and their family. As mentioned in my Layers of Fear 1 story explained video, the lore and backstory for that game was quite easy to lose track of due to where and when the information was presented to the player. It's pretty much the same here, but we will work to unpack it and lay it all out. The father of the Burns family was a photographer in the First World War, but he lost an eye during the conflict. The father was married and he and his wife eventually conceived their first child, Lily Burns. She was born, but there were complications. Lily's mother eventually conceived again and gave birth to James Burns, but as we can see from this, their mother sadly died due to complications from childbirth. James and Lily's father held the death of his wife against James, telling them that it's all his fault and that he should never have been born. The father became an alcoholic, and his increased bitterness led him to be physically and verbally abusive to both of his children. The father eventually opened a movie theatre, and James and Lily would frequently sneak into the walkways above the theatre to watch movies and to escape their abusive father.
I can't take it anymore. Make it stop.
Come on, there's nothing left for us here.
It hurts.
It's implied that the father was injured in a fire at the theatre and that James and Lily just left him there to die. It also seems that there's slightly more to it than this though, as from this document we can see that the theatre was considered a fire safety risk and needed modifying. It's therefore also considered that Lily purposely burned down the theatre as a means to get rid of their father once and for all. Either way, James and Lily then boarded a ship as stowaways. The ship also has a movie being filmed aboard it. The siblings are frequently being spotted and chased by the ship's guards, whilst they would search the ship for food. Lily tells James to stay and hide somewhere while she searches for food, but she is gone for a while, causing young James to panic. It was at some point, whilst he was scared, he heard his sister's voice in his head, telling him that when she isn't around, he should listen for her voice inside his head.
Why am I always the one? Why weren't you there? Why didn't you protect me? Why did you let this monster? Ah! Useless! Worthless! I hate you!
Now, the game is a bit fuzzy on this, but it's possible that whilst Lily was out searching for food, she was caught by the director of the film, who was already described as being quite odd, and he sexually assaulted her. I believe this scene in Act 4 is what this is referring to. Lily stabbed and killed the director. She later goes on to blame James for not being there for her. Later that evening, a storm hits and the ship is in trouble. They attempt to escape, but James gets into the lifeboat and Lily is killed. Before she dies, she states that she will always be with him and she will somehow find him again. Through the various phonograph tapes, we discover that James ended up sitting alone on a park bench and was approached by a man who grew up in the same area. The man asked James about his family and James started speaking about his sister as if she was alive.
Well, how about your sister? Is she,
She's everything.
I see. You spend a lot of time with your sister.
She's always there. And she will be forever.
James goes on to state that he enjoys sitting there as it means that he can be and play anyone he wants. The trauma has set in, but this is essentially the first path to him becoming an actor himself. Quite what happened after this, or whether this man played a bigger part of James's upbringing, isn't really known. James eventually becomes a success, starring in many films, but inwardly he's still empty and hollow, holding a bitterness towards himself due to the demise of his sister. James was a method actor, but this was essentially just a coping mechanism. As James harboured hatred towards himself, he would live as other characters to avoid living his own life. His personal troubles were widely publicised too, judging from this newspaper clipping. It came to the point when James was cast in a film on a ship despite him mentioning to his agent that he was afraid of the sea due to what happened in his past, which explains the nightmare James has at the start of the game.
Yeah, I know you've told me 1,000,000 times how much you hate the sea. And I'm telling you, this gig is just too good to pass up.
You'll play your part. You will.
So one thing that is honed in on in this game is the concept of the flame. The flame is essentially the essence or the soul of a character. One flame that James has never really been able to capture is that of his sister. There are a few narratives in this game, and these narratives build into the 3 endings we see in the game. James's journey has 2 branching narratives and one more, let's just say, a different narrative. The whole story in this game is that James has to either accept who he is, moving on from the guilt he feels, or to become and live as Lily, therefore not being able to move on and staying stuck with the guilt. You see, the reason I think the narrator is helping James is that he seems to be trying to push him towards acceptance of what happened and to help him come to terms with it. This is following, as some people say, the script. As a result, James appears as himself in his dressing room at the end of the game, and a box behind him shakes and opens the moment the game finishes. This box likely signifies that his trauma and guilt will always be there no matter what. In direct opposition to this, James can just choose to defy the narrator and go against the script, therefore not really dealing with the issue and just continuing to bury his guilt deep down inside. Now, the third option is a little more complex. Remember the Rat Queen from Layers of Fear? Well, she's back. She is the mysterious character who was pulling the head off of the child back at the start of the game. But what does she represent? First being seen in Layers of Fear 1 as just a portrait, she is seen as a physical manifestation in the second game. Well, I say a manifestation, but she only really appeared to James in a dream. Given that the 2 previously discussed pathways ended in set choices for the character, the third is more of a neutral ending. Basically, James couldn't decide and remained formless, which is what this creature refers to. It represents the indecision in James and the madness growing inside caused by the guilt and shame. You'll hopefully remember from Layers of Fear 1 that the painter was obsessed with rats. He saw them everywhere. Well, there are similarities here in that James, as a child, would draw pictures of rats. Not only that, pictures in which he seemed to be communicating with them. And this leads to the question of, is the Rat Queen a supernatural being? Judging from certain aspects of the game and James's journey into the past, it seems that James potentially ventured into the abyss to find Lily, if you like, which is shown by the sequence with the cannons and the formless man. However, in this scene here, James is on the floor stating, "She lied to me." This indicates that the Rat Queen tricked James and instead Lily's soul potentially got trapped within him. This is just a theory. Anyway, that third ending culminates in James being encircled by the Rat Queen due to the fact that they are trapped in a prison of their own making. Essentially, in short, James either lived his life in guilt and shame due to what happened with his sister, battling with himself to save her by becoming her, or moving on and accepting that Lily is gone. Or he had a supernatural encounter with an entity known as the Rat Queen and ventured into the depths to save her soul, but was instead tricked, and he had her soul trapped within him. Make of that what you will. I would be interested to know what you think down below. So who is the director? Well, we spoke of the flame and how it's essentially the soul and essence of the character being played, or acted if you will. Some have speculated that the director is none other than the Rat Queen in disguise, pushing James to make a final decision on his identity and who he wants to be. He is described as being a character who has a rather unique way of getting actors to prepare the role, namely building the character, as is a theme throughout the entire game.
Guy's got a reputation. Makes his actors jump through hoops before he even lets them on the set. Supposed to be some new method of building the character. Bunch of artsy-fartsy bullshit if you ask me. Just go with it. Guy doesn't take no for an answer. So what if the guy's a little nuts? He's a director. It comes with the job.
He is considered rather eccentric, mysterious, and also a recluse. He does seem to know a lot about James and his background, and towards the end of the game he mentions to James that this film will be his last, so whether he is dying or simply retiring is not known. At one point the director states this:
This was to be my final work. To reclaim what was lost. To let go of the stolen fire. To reignite the true flame. But now the spark. It is almost gone. It is lost. Hopeless. Just like you.
The director seems to know about the flame that James is trying to capture, Lily's flame, and he insinuates that a stolen flame will burn out, ergo it will not last forever, which I guess is why the director seems to want James to lean towards finally accepting that Lily is gone. Either way, this note suggests that the director has a specific role in mind, and that only James's broken, hollow self is able to build this character. It does seem that the director could just be a part of James's mind, and is trying to save himself and get past the guilt. So to finish and round this video off, there are similarities in this game to a psychological study by Swedish psychiatrist Carl Jung around the shadow and the persona, where the persona is a representation of personality and the mask that we put on in society that shows ourselves, with the shadow being the part of you that you know is there, but that you don't really want to accept. But in order to fully accept one, you have to go through the process of killing the other. Hence why, in order to move on, James has to choose to kill off either James or Lily. And that's basically it. There's not that much to this game in terms of moving parts, as it's pretty much just one man's recollection of the past and his trauma and guilt. It was just a hard one to piece together if you've maybe missed documents or misunderstood the complex storyline. But if you did enjoy this one, please leave a like on the video and subscribe if you aren't already. Leave a comment down below with your thoughts and theories, but for now, take care, and I will see you in the next one.